Hi, welcome to the next chapter in this video series. So in this one, we're going to be talking about grouping. Grouping is a method of simplifying visual information to focus it and make it easier for the viewer to understand. Additionally, it allows you to create, naturally, areas of rest and high detail, as well as simplify many smaller structures into a more large and complex one. We do this by placing details into groups rather than all over. It's important to minimize and simplify. Grouping is a way of minimizing what the mind has to sort through to find importance. It's also a method of adding extra detail without overwhelming the viewer. It's interconnected with detailed distribution pretty closely. We can also use it to support function and fake it and imply it without even trying. We kind of briefly touched on this in the detailed distribution chapter, but let's go over a little bit more in depth what grouping is. So I'm going to start with a grocery store example in an airport, and then we're going to talk about some other more contextual examples so we can learn how to apply and see this principle. Alright, so we got Photoshop open. Let's talk about grocery stores. So I was at a grocery store recently and I was talking to someone about design and trying to explain it. And so I started looking around and I realized that there was actually, the grocery store itself was a pretty good example of, a lot of things that are in design theory, but especially grouping and hierarchy. So I just want to talk about and break this down for a little bit. So normally people will struggle or could struggle to find something in a store, but generally it's pretty easy. But why is it easy? Okay, it's organized, but how? Why? Let's take a look at this sign, for example. So we talked about hierarchy, right? We talked about how the human mind likes hierarchy. It likes to break things down into most important, second most important, and third most. After that, the human mind kind of has trouble deciding what's most important. So for the hierarchy, and we can even see by the design of this sign that they've established a hierarchy. They have the primary information. This is aisle 9. There's 10 aisles. This is our primary piece of information, how we get around the store. So this is an example of hierarchy, because below that, the secondary information is, here's what's on aisle 9. We have cat food, cat treats, dog food, kitty litter, all that shit. So right here, we have two examples of hierarchy. Now, while we've also created hierarchy, another thing we're doing consequently is grouping. We're creating, a group of objects. We're taking all of the cat stuff and we're putting it under aisle 9. Now, when someone says, oh, I need to find some pet things. Oh, they're under aisle 9. It's very clear. And then under aisle 9, you decide, okay, where's the cat food? Where's the cat treats? And then even those will be grouped. If you look closely, you'll notice that basically everything in here has some sort of little group. It has a little pattern. We like to place things and organize things as human beings. Even in our social structures, we have different groups. We take the idea of like, oh, we have let's say a political party, right? You don't have to name everyone in the political party to talk about it. We just say that political party. Same thing. You don't have to list, the Cheetos, the Lays, the whatever. Like, we just go to the chip aisle. It's simple. It's organized. It's grouped. We like to group stuff. I was thinking about this actually on a walk while I was making this tutorial, and I realized, okay, I have my art supplies that I carry with me. I have my pens and my pencils, and I put them in a box, a little group. I have my pencils. So I think that grocery stores are interesting because it's kind of a very clear example of what we try to do with our art and why the human mind prefers certain types of organizational patterns. Why certain things make it easier to understand. If every single one of these items was placed all over the store and there was no pattern to it, how are you supposed to make any sense of it? You can't. It's the same thing with design. We can't just place things everywhere, a million different things. We have to be very conscious of how the human mind is going to interpret what we look at. So grouping is one way of doing that and simplifying a lot of complex things. Another way that, another example I like, and you could also call this echoing. I kind of touched on it in the echoing chapter with the example of the floating plant stand. But grouping off certain areas I actually don't have the picture, even though I wish I did. But a lot of electronics sections in certain stores, they may outline the border or perimeter of the electronics section with maybe a raised ceiling, a lowered one, something. Oftentimes, when we do architectural things, it's important that you are creating defined spaces. And it's the same thing in our art. Like, we need to make sure that things are clear, things are organized, even though they can be interesting and cool. So even if you're making some kind of like Space Ranger fucking doing a backflip off the space station with gun and pizza in his hand, like, you can still follow all of these rules to make it visually pleasing. But yeah, so back to this example. I really enjoy these examples because what they do is they ground the area spatially in your mind. So by repeating and echoing that top thing, we've started to group and define places. This is where you walk. We use a different material on this floor to say, oh, this is where you relax and sit and wait for the airplane. We outline the border of the space so that way it's easier to understand its extents and identify it as a singular piece rather than a bunch of disparate information. You can even see here that they've used grouping to try and group these storefronts so that it becomes a little bit more simplified for people to understand. In fact, if you study airport design, you'll realize quickly how important the human mind and perception is to making a good airport design. So quickly, I just wanted to show again, they clearly are grouping and sectioning off terminals and specific areas because it makes it easier for people to understand. This is what we're doing with our art. It's not about the idea, it's about how you sell the idea and how you present it. And so I just wanted to illustrate how important organization is. So now that I've gotten these two examples out of the way, let's go delve into some more artistic contextual examples. Alright, so now I've got Photoshop open. Let's take a look at some more artistic and contextual detail. So here I've made this example of, kind of what I do most of the time, which is sci-fi stuff and hard surface. And so I wanted to show a little bit how grouping can be used in this way and how it, I think, makes things not only look more functional, but more interesting and more clear. So obviously on the left, we have a very evenly distributed, very all over the place kind of design. Everything's kind of placed in the middle. There's no grouping, and it's feeling very weak and very random. So when we start taking those details, changing their sizes, their placements, their proportions, and grouping them into a few smaller but more interesting pieces instead of a bunch of really uninteresting ones, we start to find more complex combinations we can make. And not only that, but more focused. So oftentimes when I'm making stuff, I'll think, I don't have to think like, oh, this is this mechanism and this is that. When you're making, let's say, a whole level and you have 3 weeks to populate like a whole sci-fi corridor, you don't have time to think every single thing through. You're going fast. You have to do all the technical stuff, especially if you're a game artist, environment artist. So it's our job to kind of, approximate function. And so I find that grouping, even though it's an abstract principle, tends to make things look more functional because think about it like this. So like, let's say that this thing here generates water, right? Let's say this generates water. So instead of having like, oh, let's have this water generator and then a thing here and a thing here and a thing here. Let's make this water generator really nice and really strong. Let's really put a lot of details in it. Let's make this a focal point or an area of interest. Let's try and have transitional details. And then we have our rest space. And then we have another piece. And I think by doing this, it actually will feel more functional because we start creating areas of details that are connected. And when they're connected, they feel more like a cohesive unit, right? Like if you had maybe some kind of complex detail here instead of just like a little bolt, and maybe you had like a bolt and a screw, then you start saying, oh, okay, well, so I have a bolt, and then there's probably an internal mechanism across these two panels that the bolts are that these latches are connected to. So we start having multiple details reinforcing each other. And so I like to use it to imply function and structure, but also just to simplify stuff. You know, we don't need details all over. We talked about detail distribution in our in one of the other chapters, which I believe is actually chapter 9. But basically just the idea of putting things where things connect, like putting details there. But yeah, so take a bunch of stuff, make it a few make it a fewer things, but combine stuff and have groups of details. Don't spread everything out. I think this is very crucial. So the next example is Darren Bacon has this painting, and I always thought that this was a good example of grouping because he used, instead of having like a bunch of different pelicans, or sorry, phaetons and banshees all over the place and just going crazy with these spaceships, he chose to have groups instead. And so by grouping all these different objects, we've simplified the read, and also inversely, functionally, you know, they could be formations, right? Like things that you do sometimes with some of the visual design rules, I find because they're psychologically connected to other behaviors that humans do, we actually build logic unintentionally out of these rules because it's all about the mind, right? So I thought this is another good example and a better contextual example. Let's go to a different example and kind of talk about sci-fi stuff again. So here's one of my designs, and one of the things that I do a lot in this design is I try and take areas that are very detailed and I try and group them, as I've said repeatedly, because once we start doing that, we have these nice areas of rest. Like I've said before, it makes it much easier for the eye to focus on where the interesting things are happening than get caught up on what's going on in between them. So here we have like a nice bit of travel space, right? Like we try and give the eye room to travel, and there's not just crazy details, there's just subtle details, but then I have very strongly grouped details. I think that this is really important. And I have a lot of other examples similar to this one, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. So I was going around my apartment complex, as I talked about, and so this is another example of basically the exact same thing I showed on my gun and in another part of the tutorial, where we have areas of grouped detail. So like for example, we have tons of details and cables on this one power supply, if not all of them. This is where our highest detail concentration is. But you'll notice, just like the example that is going to be given, when you think about where things connect, this is usually where detail is focused. So by grouping certain areas of detail, we've created this nice line work in between them, this area of rest and this connection. And so that way, it's not a constant visual intensity. We have areas of visual intensity and areas of rest just by grouping. And so I never actually think about rest area a ton because a lot of the ways that I think about other things end up creating those automatically. So here's another interesting thing for grouping and how people perceive it, and also how it's tied to architecture. So I was going around looking at this, and so just like our last example, we had hierarchy in the grocery store. You'll notice that there's also hierarchy and simplification going on within apartment complexes, for example. So if you look at this apartment complex, let's break this down. We can actually guess approximately how many people live in this building based on the fact that they've grouped and organized this cleanly. It's easy to tell what's an apartment complex and what's not. So first of all, on our large hierarchy level, we have 4 of these houses. We can tell we have 4 buildings. Grouped underneath that, we have 4 apartments. And you can tell because the group per apartment is a balcony with a window. And so we can now just safely assume that unless this is a split balcony, that they have grouped these 2 things together. And so now we can kind of see what's going on. We can understand visually a little bit easier, whose apartment's what, maybe which entrance I should go to on the other side. The information is much more organized, and we can even make guesses about how many people are living here. So that's a good example of how hierarchy can help simplify and make things easier to understand. So with that said, I'll show you my other picture that I found. So this apartment complex, it's very hard to tell Is this a top floor and a bottom floor? Are these one room? Is this one apartment? Is it a 2-story? Is this a, 1 story, and is this the next? It's very ambiguous. There's not a lot of grouping going on. It's a little bit hard to tell what's going on. So this is an example of basically the opposite of that. The only thing that we do know is that it's probably split somewhere in the middle. So this one's a little bit less clear. You might even go to the other side and be not sure exactly which apartment it is. So while I'm not saying that this is like, oh, you need to group all your apartments, but I think it's a good example of how in the real world humans usually like to group objects. We like to simplify things, and how we can just use, space, positioning, value, and all of these things to simplify what the human mind has to look at and make it easier for them to read. So one of the other examples, and a little bit more contextual, that I'd like to talk about is grouping in the context of placing details, which I already covered, but basically you can see here on the sci-fi floor, I've created these pockets of details, and by creating pockets of details, we've created these nice empty rest areas. It's very important that we are careful about this. But so not only have I just grouped these detail areas, I've grouped individual details functionally, as I mentioned earlier. So for example, this is one of my, something that I talked about briefly is basically I have my latch, and so I imagine, an understructure, and I try and place objects and details to support this latch. I don't like to place a detail without supporting it with something else. Like, for example, I made sure that this detail was echoed by this line, and then I created a detail group with about 2 or 3 other details. And by also placing it near a bunch of other details, you could almost just say that this is a detail group if we looked at the longer context of the floor. And so it's very important that we are careful with how we're grouping, and how grouping can just immediately add rest areas. So the last example I'd like to go over really quickly is the light switch example. And it's basically the exact same thing I just went over on the floor, but instead I'm using a light switch that I found downstairs. So you'll notice that we have the main group, or hierarchically we have our large primary structure, and grouped under this we have our secondary structures, the light switches. And then we have our tertiary, which is these smaller details. The thing that I like about this light switch is that because of the fact that these are right above the light switch and grouped with each light switch, that each of these screws is connected to the light switch without actually seeing their internal connection. And so this is something that I was trying to explain with the sci-fi floor. It's important to try and it's not necessarily that you have to try, but when you do place your details, you're going to make more sense of things than placing them all over. And it's generally a much safer bet, and it'll look a lot more clear, organized, and easy for the mind to understand. Instead of having like 5 screws everywhere, the mind just sees 3 simple structures. It doesn't see like 5 screws, 3 light switches that are, randomly placed. It's very understandable. And then when we zoom out of this, we're just like, oh, it's the light switches. Like, that's that one thing. It's very organized. It's very simple. It has hierarchy. So hopefully by the end of this, you see why grouping is important, and also some very contextual ways to use grouping. I think the detailed distribution chapter is going to also have some very important examples that will help you with this. So yeah, with that said, I'll see you guys in the next chapter.